Hello everybody, it's Erin LaFaive here of Full Circle Herbals, and I'm answering some questions for the Green Witch Gardening series. So a question that's come in a couple times is about their seedlings, about starting seeds. So here's my flat of seeds in their cell packs. And I labeled mine by the numbers here. So here's number 2, number 3, number 4, and so on. These are from bread bags and other like produce holding the bags together, so I reuse them. And I have a permanent marker on there. Let me get this microphone closer to me. So then instead of having to put labels in every single cell pack and me having to find something that'll stay waterproof, I use these. So they're nice hard plastic, permanent marker on there, and then I just numbered my seed packets. So I know what number 2 is up here. It's a type of melon. So for now, this works really well. When I go to put them out in the garden, I'll probably make different kinds of labels because these are too small right now, but I like these so far. They're really stuck on there. They're not moving around. So the question that's coming in is what happens if the plants get leggy? These ones are getting a little bit leggy. As you see, they're really stretching. There's not much for leaves on this part of the plant, which it's okay. But we don't want them to get so tall with just like 2 leaves, and then they don't get strong enough and they start tipping over and they're just not as robust as they could be. This is my spinach here. Oh, this one's good. This is a good. I just saw that there's a true leaf coming on this one. See, that's called a true leaf. You can start to see the characteristics of the cucumber that's growing there. These leaves here are just their first leaves that come through the surface, and then the true leaves start to come through. So what happens is they start stretching towards the light. If you have them at a window, they're going to be stretching for the light. Even though they might be right up against the window, they're still trying to get this more stronger and stronger sunlight. And coming through a south-facing window sometimes isn't even enough because it's kind of coming at them from one direction. So what I do is probably 2 or 3 times a day, depending if I'm around, I'll just switch them. I'll turn them this way, and then they have to start bending the other way and start stretching. And then eventually I turn them the other way, and then they have to start stretching that way, and so on and so forth. What that does, it gives them exercise and helps to create a stronger stem so that they're actually using their energy to go back and forth and moving around rather than just stretching in one direction. Because if they just stretch in one direction, they'll just like get really, really long stretching that one way. But if you just turn them around, then they have to go the other way. So they're not creating so much height up this way. They're actually just kind of staying, they're growing a little bit up and up, but since they're using their energy to reach back and forth, they don't necessarily have to grow so tall. This one's getting pretty tall. The other thing you can do is get a light, a grow light, a full spectrum light, or just a shop light is what I call it, just something that's used in shops. And they're long, and they go this way. And you want them to be about 2 to 3 inches right above the seedlings so that it's right above them and they just want to stand straight. They don't want to have to stretch necessarily too much to get to the stronger light. They're just going to grow at their normal pace. I have a light right now that sits right in the middle, and even the ones on the outside, the plants on the outside, are trying to stretch towards the middle, so I still have to move them around. It would be more ideal if I had a light hanging on either side of this flat of seedlings. That would be better, because then they would have more uniform light, not a bunch of really strong light in the middle and a lot at the sides. Another way that you can get them to be strong is to put a little bit of just a light fan on them so they kind of are wiggling around. That will also get their cells to respond and to try to makes a little bit more of a growing around the middle rather than growing up so high, being elongated. So just a light fan on them. It doesn't have to be on them. It just can be moving the air around them enough so that maybe you can see them moving. Another way that to keep them strong and to make them strong is something called hardening off. That's what you do when they're getting closer and closer to getting planted outside. So just take the flat and you'll put it outside on a nice day, not a rainy day, but put it outside. It can be cloudy or sunny. Either way, make sure they're in the shade for the first few times that you set them out there. Of course, make sure it's not very cold. If it's enjoyable for you out there, it's most likely going to be enjoyable for the plants, you know. And it gets them used to the temperature change outside. It gets them used to the wind movement, the change in sunlight. They're used to being in a home that has, for the most part, very stable light and heat conditions inside. So if you put these right out into the garden right away, they might get a little bit of a shock because they're not used to that change in temperature and light and all that. So put them outside for maybe an hour and bring them back in, and do that for a few days, maybe even up to a week, and just let them sit out longer and longer, and eventually, you know, introduce them to the sunlight and watch them very closely, because if they really get a lot of hot sun right away on them, they're pretty supple right now and delicate. So if they get a lot of heat on them, they'll wilt, and wilting's okay, but if they wilt really fast and they don't get enough water right away, you can really damage the cells and they'll die. So that's some tips on making them not so leggy. Like I said, some of mine are getting there, but some of them are okay. Just doing what I can. If they do get too leggy, they can still be planted outside. What will most likely happen is they will start to get bushier over time. It's just that you want to put them out there when they're at their most ideal, when they're really ready to grow. And you don't really want to have them sit for a few days or some weeks trying to adjust and not become leggy. Leggy, you know, you want to have leaves on your stems so that they can be making photosynthesis and bringing some nutrients to the plant. And if they're really leggy without any leaves on them, you can expose them to too much sun, and they just not going to do as well. But again, they will eventually they'll come along. All right, so the other question is, what happens if I accidentally put too many seeds in one cell pack and now I have a huge clump of them? So these, there's spinach here. There's 3 of them in a container. There's 3 of them right in there. So if you get too many in one pot, which is very easy to, it can happen very easily. Sometimes it's fine. It depends on the type of plant that you have in there. For example, let's say you have 2 stems of basil growing at the same time in there. They'll likely grow just fine, turning their leaves toward the sun, and the other one will grow and turn its leaves on the other side. Kind of think of 2 people back to back, you know, that you both have room, you both can see what you're doing, you'll be just fine. But then if you try to put 20 people in the same spot where you're all standing, it's just too much, it's too crowded, there's not enough resources. So that can happen to a lot of different types of plants. A lot of times it happens when plants have really tiny seeds and you go to plant and all the little seeds just fall all over. Chamomile is a good example of that. And what you would do in those instances, if you had too many in the same spot, is you could, once the plant got a little bit bigger and you're able to get it out of its cell pack, you could actually break apart the root balls and divide them up and either plant them in the ground if they're ready, or find another pot to put them in. Let's see if I can do this as an example. They're kind of small right now, but I'm going to give it a try just to show you as a demonstration. So what I'm going to do is just gently pull. The soil is very nice and just properly wet, not overly wet. There we go, that's perfect. So you see how I have that ball there? And what I'll do is just gently take the soil off and try to loosen them and untangle them. So there, we've got one. Now this is spinach. So there's one. And then what I can do is, now there's no, I don't know if you can see it, but I'm sticking my finger in the soil right now. There we go, because there's a seed did not grow there. It didn't come up. So what I'm going to do is try to plant this one over here. So I just stuck my finger in the dirt and created a hole, and then stuck the root in there, and just planting it right there. You go. You can see that. And so then I have another one, a little bit more soil on there, so I'm going to have to make a bigger hole. Oh, perfect. That one's stuck right in there. And now I have this last one. And I have another spot right here. So you see, I thinned them out that way, and that worked really, really well. Some plants, not as easy to thin them out. Tomatoes are great and easy to thin. I mean, they're very forgiving of being pulled apart. Sometimes the root ball gets quite intertwined together, and you do have to kind of rip them apart. And like I said, they're usually very forgiving. So then what else can you do? Oh, the other thing you can do is if you've, sometimes I've had like 15, 20 little seedlings coming up in one little area, and it's just, I don't need that many. So I certainly could pull them apart and share them with others, but there's been many times where I actually just come in with little scissors and cut out what I don't want anymore, and they just get sacrificed. And then that allows, one or two to really grow really strong, not have to share the space and the nutrients in the water supply. So that's what you can do if you want to divide them still while they're in their cell pack. Now you see this, there's little tiny ones coming up right here. I wouldn't divide those. Those are too small. You really want them to get their leaves, some leaves going, and something of a root ball going. I will not be thinning out cucumbers or my melons. They hate to be disturbed with their roots. And so if there's more than one that comes up for this situation, first of all, more than one cucumber or melon together is just fine. Lots of them are vining anyway, so you can vine them away from each other, and they're not going to crowd each other out too much. But this would be a good example of having to clip one or two out for those types of plants that don't like to be removed and disturbed. It's going to be good to keep them in the soil as long as I can before I put them outside. This same type of technique can also be used in the garden. So if you've made a row of chamomile and there's 100 little babies coming up, you're going to probably want to go in there and just snip some out, or just use your fingernail and clip them out. Because if you start disturbing them and trying to pull them apart, you're going to get die-off anyways, because they've been so disrupted. And then you may not have enough room to put all these baby chamomiles all over the place. You could also pull some, take some out of the ground if they're in the garden already. Take some of those baby ones out and put them in cell packs just like this, so that they can grow a little bit better, and then you can give them away to people. So those are some ideas of how to thin things out so everything has room. It is hard at first if you're new time gardening to clip things off and let them die off, because you work so hard to get them going, but really over time you get used to it and you realize the benefits of giving them more room, whether or not you're pulling them apart and replanting them, or you're just cutting them off at ground level. So those are my tips for that. You can see that some of my seedlings did not come up yet. Either they were not viable because they were too old, or they're just taking a lot longer. Some things need 2-3 weeks in order to germinate. So one of the things that did not germinate is this calendula, but it does say it takes 5 to 15 days to germinate, and this has been in here a couple weeks. It might be a little chilly for them too. My house isn't super warm. but it's not super cold either, but they just might be waiting for some more warmer temperatures. Okay, let's see. Some other tips based on some comments people have had. So some container gardening tips that I would have for you. Some best practices for having container gardens. I'm trying to get this there. So with containers, if you have different size containers, here's my biggest tip. And it kind of encompasses two things, but the tip is about watering. The watering that you do for a container garden can make or break it. So you want to give water to your container in a way that it can actually drip out. So you're going to have some drainage holes in the container so that any extra water will actually run out of the container and go away from the roots. You don't want those roots to be sitting in that container of water because they will suffocate. They need oxygen. And also other diseases that really thrive in wet, overly wet soils can take hold in that situation too. They're just in the soil, just waiting for perfect conditions for them to come out and thrive. And if there's too much water, that that might be their preferred environment. So you don't want diseases. The other tip I have is that when you do water deeply and infrequently. So what that means is when you go to water your container, you're going to water it until it comes out the bottom. You're not just going to water a little bit to keep to keep that first few inches of soil moist. You want the water to come out the bottom. If you only have that top layer of soil that's moist, then those roots are going to want to hang out there. And then you have shallow rooted roots. You actually want them to get as big and long as you can, because then when the first layer of soil is drying out, they'll actually stretch and go down farther to find any type of, to find some more water source that way. That just makes them robust and be able to survive any kind of drought-like conditions much better. So, and what I mean by infrequently is that sometimes people think, oh, they need to have moist soil all the time. So I'm just going to give them, a cup of water every day so that they always have some water to drink. And actually that, again, creates that shallow root system because they're only getting water on the top. And they do need a little bit of dry out once in a while so that those diseases and insects that love that wet, moist soil don't stay there and take advantage of it. So dry out is good at times. So just think of yourself being in a bath for 24 hours a day. Like the bath is nice for maybe the first half hour, and then after a while it's just too much. You actually want to dry out a little bit. So think of plants that way too. So what I do is let's pretend this is my little container. It's got holes in the bottom and all that. I get used to how heavy it feels. So when you first put some seeds or plants in there and you have the soil, it's going to feel much different than when the plants get super big and you have the soil in there. What usually happens is when you first plant it and you have it full of water, the water's run out the bottom, it feels pretty heavy because you've got really wet soil in there. And then as the plant grows, the nutrients get taken out of that potting mix, the roots take over, and when it's wet, it just has a different feel to it. It's not as dense, not as heavy as it was when you first planted it. And then you'll also get used to how it feels when it's really dry. So you don't always have to be sticking your finger about an inch down in the soil to see if it's moist and needs water. You just can kind of like rock it a little bit and then be like, oh yeah, I can tell that it needs some water, or it looks really dry on the surface, but it feels really heavy. So those are some good ways to determine if it needs water. If it really feels heavy, like it's waterlogged, but it looks dry on top, just leave it alone. It'll be okay. All right, let's see. Any other tips I can give you for this spring session of Greenwich gardening? We've talked about a lot of things, about factors to consider, about where to put a garden, what kind of garden methods to use, how to put seeds in the ground or create transplants like that. what things to consider for soil choices and sun requirements, and also how to choose which plants to put in the ground. So there's lots of great information in the videos that I had sent. I tried to keep everything short enough so that you could find time to actually learn about the gardening techniques, but not too short so that it was incomplete information. Summer session for Greenwich gardening probably will go in a little bit more in depth in some of these topics, because as the plants grow, you're going to notice different needs that they have, and perhaps more pests will be coming around, and we'll get into topics of like, how do I know when to harvest, and what do I do if this problem occurs or that it's not doing that well. And then fall, we'll probably definitely be talking about harvesting, drying, things like that. And then also, like fall, winter, be talking about how to put the garden to sleep, get it ready for the dormant season, and some things you can do to get it ready and happy for that dormant season, and then when it wakes up in the spring again. So Greenwich gardening is going to be a seasonal thing, and I look forward to helping people out with their vegetables, fruits, and herbs through the Greenwich gardening course. Well, thanks for joining in. Let me know if you have any questions. Take care.